Well, I'm not the kind of guy who says, I told you so, but I told you so. 2 years ago, I put together a presentation on what I call the infertility nightmare, and I'll be showing you some slides from that quite shortly. And if you want to look at it, you can do the course for free because I anticipated these issues well ahead of time. And it's simply because when you understand the science, you can ask the right questions. Well, what did I tell you so about? It was to do with this paper. Published, well, it's pre published in the sense that it is saying the 30th of August 2025. So this is an early share of it, validating community concerns of menstrual changes associated COVID-19 vaccination using a self-controlled case series analysis of real-world data. So this is an important paper because a lot of women were gaslit and told that maybe it was in their head that this pattern of abnormal menstrual bleeding was not actually real. Now, the problem with people who have a narrative versus people who are actually looking at science is that when you have a narrative, you ignore unusual observations. When you're doing science, anything that doesn't fit, you want to take a good look at because you don't want to miss anything important. This is how I know that what happened in the pandemic wasn't really about science. Scientists and people interested in science are asking questions all the time, probing everything, trying to understand what is going on. They are not ignoring abnormal patterns as to what exactly happened in terms of the situation here. So, as I said, menstrual bleeding was a real issue. It was something that was relevant and it was overlooked. Unforgivable, unforgivable. So, here is the paper. And this important thing to notice here is that it's from Australia. As I said, it's very just really published. And Australia is important because in Australia, they didn't have infection initially. They largely locked down the country and vaccinated before facing the virus. We know what happened afterwards. The virus came and still infected everybody, but so be it. It's what I guess they expected. But it means that their cohort was primarily pure vaccination and not a combination of vaccination and infection or infection and so on. So it was clean. And so we get an idea from this as to what was going on. When we look in detail as to what they did, this is from the abstract here, is that the first thing is that they acknowledge the stories of menstrual changes occurring post COVID vaccination have abounded, with many affected persons expressing frustration that their concerns are not being heard. That is perfectly correct. And they are right to be frustrated because why in the world would anybody ignore a pattern that you didn't expect? Science would want to understand. So they were then worried about misinformation. Maybe these women who are having abnormal bleeding were just saying this because they didn't want people to get vaccinated. I mean, talk about when people are locked into a narrative. That makes no sense whatsoever. Anyway, what they then did is that they went to look in more detail as to what was happening. So they did a two-pronged approach. Firstly, they looked at social media for discussions on menstrual changes associated with COVID vaccination using a deep learning framework. And that may have been one of the reasons why it has taken longer for it to come out, because only when we have these deep learning AI techniques can we do this kind of study. Additionally, they took a large de-identified Australian general practice dataset to validate any evidence of increased menstrual disturbances for females aged 40 to 15 to 49. And so they used two techniques to try and clarify what was going on. And as I said, it is remarkable that this was not taken seriously earlier in the pandemic. I mean, you have to understand that the menstrual period is one of the most sensitive physiological mechanisms that we have. This is why it's so important, meaning that almost anything can make a menstrual period go off. People who are stressed, people who are exercising a lot, certain medication, it is extremely sensitive. And it is not commonly associated with vaccines. That's another important part. I mean, I think the HPV vaccine can sometimes do that, but in small amounts. So the numbers involved here were very, very strange. And so when they looked at it, what they found was that they were finding a lot of information in terms of the content on social media between March of 2021 to about October of 2021. And then a further peak here in June or July of 2022. And this may have been the booster campaign. But this was significant. We're talking about a high proportion of people mentioning that this was an issue that was going on. We're talking about almost 8,000, 9,000 comments with regards to what was happening in terms of menstrual irregularities. It was a red flag. I really don't know how people can justify not actually looking in detail as to what was happening. So, just a few simple physiological points. As I said, this is the anatomy of the female reproductive tract, and you have here the ovary, the fallopian tubes, and the uterus. This is a cut section of the uterus. And what usually happens is that you have a connection basis, which is why you have a buildup of the lining in the uterus. And at the end of the cycle, it's shed, which causes the menstrual bleeding. It's a very, very sophisticated system. It's tied closely together with estrogen surge coming up here in the first section of the cycle. Then here you have ovulation. The ovulation is then associated with a building up of the lining in terms of the uterus, just in case this egg gets fertilized. And this cycle goes through every single month until a woman goes into menopause. What's very interesting here is the progesterone end of the cycle, which is towards the end of the cycle, and it comes down, and then you have the shedding of the lining. The reason I mention this is that someone just recently shared with me a paper when they were looking at in vitro fertilization, and one of the unusual things they noticed between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated cohort was that the IgG levels, higher IgG levels, were associated with higher levels of progesterone. And so it makes me wonder, because in the same way that we can use oral contraceptive pills with regards to progesterone, which just interrupt that estrogen progesterone cycle, what you could have is therefore hormonal changes around progesterone impacting estrogen, and therefore no ovulation, and therefore no bleeding or excessive bleeding. It just depends on the kind of cycle that a woman has. This is all very, very complicated. But as I said to you, not to investigate it, to leave it, and to mandate for young females, low risk of severe COVID. I'm telling you, I mean, when history looks back at this in 50 years, they are going to be aghast at, I cannot believe this was science. Because from a scientific point of view, it's just so strange. Even if you believed that when you saw these kinds of patterns and you knew that men were at higher risk than women, obesity, older age, specific comorbidities, young women who have menstrual periods would therefore be in one of the lowest risk cohorts. And yet, some, or let me be careful here because if I say that, I may get censored for it. But you can understand what I'm saying. I mean, it really, really is quite remarkable that this was done in this way. And so when you look at the study here, as I said, it doesn't seem as though it mattered what type of vaccine was used, because they looked at all the vaccines in terms of the relative incidence across a window. So they think that it was about up to 14 weeks of symptoms. That's where the window was. They said about 3 months in total. The mRNA vaccines, I had some adenoviral vector vaccines also as well. So this therefore means it's not specifically related to the lipid nanoparticle, but may be connected more to spike protein itself. One of the things that I did in the presentation is that I found that a part of the spike protein, the S2 part of it, binds to the estrogen receptor. And it is quite possible that some mechanism like this, whether or not it's an autoimmune mechanism, whether or not it's a direct spike protein mechanism, whether or not it's that lipid nanoparticles concentrated in the ovaries, as was seen in some animals early on, we don't know. All I know is this: when we look back at this, and especially because globally fertility seems to be going down, and they will link it to everything else but anything related to this. They'll talk about microplastics. They'll probably talk about solar emissions, heat, climate change, but never mention this. So we are at a situation or a time frame where finally proper research is being done. But the reality is this: it's almost too late, because we've already done the work, we've done the intervention. And so now this is about, let us keep our fingers crossed that there are no issues. Don't let anybody tell you that there are no issues. They have no idea. We don't know. I don't know if there are issues. Somebody else doesn't know if they're not. We are too early in the cycle. We are at a point now where we just have to hope and pray that there are no issues, because that is an absolute nightmare. That's the reality. That would be an absolute nightmare. And my instinct is, based on all the angles that I have looked at, and for those who have been following me, I've been looking at autoimmune responses as being the primary mechanism. If we have even an increase in autoimmune responses that are associated with infertility or associated with miscarriages, if that rises, we definitely have serious problems on our hands. My hope is that at least if we do the science, at least if we try and understand it objectively, looking carefully to see whether or not there could be, that you really have to understand why. That's really the first question. Why? Why would it have an impact? That's your first question. And as you go through the question and you look at all the mechanisms, depending on what you find as the reason with regards to the mechanisms, will determine if this could be a longer term issue. As I say, we live in hope, but sadly, that's all we can do now, because if there is damage, it has already been done. Let's hope for the best. Thank you.